To Fra John Core, by order of the king, to make aquavitae 8 bowls of malt. This is the first written reference to distilling in Scotland. It dates from an Exchequer roll of 1494. The king was King James IV, a great Renaissance prince. It's interesting that he was ordering aquavitae, i.e. water of life, uisge distilled from malted barley, and that the order was given to a friar, a learned friar. It's quite clear that by this time, friars or people in holy orders knew how to distill. It's also quite interesting to learn that King James IV himself was campaigning on Islay that year, 1494, against the Lord of the Isles. Now, the lordship was, the period of the lordship was a time of high culture, and the Lords of the Isles had attached to them hereditary physicians called macbearcha in Gaelic, or beaten in English. The first macbearcha arrived on Islay in 1300 in the marriage train of an Irish gentlewoman, princess, who married the first Lord of the Isles, Angus Og, and in her marriage train came this family of macbearchas, or beatons as they were called later. They were known as learned physicians, and indeed Patrick macbearcha was lent by Angus Og to King Robert I, Robert the Bruce, 2 years after they arrived in 1302, and Patrick cured him of some terrible ailment, and his family later became hereditary physicians to the kings of Scots. Fergus macbearcha remained with the lordship, and his successors became hereditary physicians to the Lords of the Isles. And I would think it's likely that King James IV first encountered aquavitae, uisge on the island of Islay. I've said that by the time they arrived in Islay in 1300, the Beatons were already known as learned physicians. But where did they learn about distilling? Well, the foundations of Western medicine were Arabic, basically. And these Arab scholars of from the 9th century certainly, and particularly in the mid-12th century, used distilling as a way of making medicines and making perfumes. A lot of the words connected today even with distilling derive from Arabic. We think of an alembic, we think of alcohol, we think of alchemy, all Arabic words deriving from Arabic. It's well known that the Beatons they were described as great Arabists, and indeed translated a lot of medical texts which had come from the Arabic and been translated into Greek and Latin, and they then translated them into Gaelic. A lot of these fragments are still held today by the Faculty of Advocates in Edinburgh. So they will have been familiar with the secrets of distillation in relation to medicine. But it may have been even earlier. Last year, a friend of mine who was a professor of French, or retired professor of French in Edinburgh University, came upon an extraordinary discovery in the Latin text, the lives of the Irish saints, concerning St. Ruadhan of Lothra, who died in 584. In this Latin text, it reads, "There were 3 times 50 monks in the monastery of Lothra with St. Ruadhan. For there was a cask in the curia of the monastery, whose sap gave a sufficiency to the aforesaid monks and their guests. For this sap of this same sweet tree was powerful, and sufficed to all who tasted it as much for food as for drink. When they heard about this, the monks from all over Ireland ran away from their monasteries to go to the place in which they had heard so much divine grace was to be found." Now, Graham Martin interprets this, deconstructs it. We've got a tree, a magical tree. For tree, read wood. For wood, read cask, possibly. The curia is both a courtyard and a house, a room within the abbey. It is therefore possible to interpret this magical liquor as possibly being distilled spirit. They would hardly flock from all over Ireland for some ale, which was well known. And this is dated, as I say, from the 6th century, from about 584 AD. Now, this is somewhat whimsical to suggest that the Irish saints were making and drinking whiskey, but nevertheless, it's possible. So where does that leave us? That great whiskey writer Aeneas MacDonald wrote in 1930, "The origin of whiskey is, as it ought to be, hidden in the clouds of mystery that veil the youth of the human race." Maybe the Irish saints in the 6th century were distilling. Certainly Arab scholars in Egypt and in the Middle East were distilling, say, certainly by the 10th century. The great medical schools in southern Italy knew about distilling in the early medieval period. By 1300, it was being brought to Scotland by the Beaton family. And then we come to full circle to the first written reference, Fra John Core and King James IV in 1494.